On a rainy Tuesday evening in Chicago, a woman named Victoria Langston, one of the wealthiest women in the country, sat perfectly upright in the corner of an upscale restaurant that only the city's elite could afford. At 81 years old, Victoria moved through the world with quiet precision. Her hair was pinned into a flawless twist. Her pearls gleamed under the chandelier, and every glance she gave felt like it could stop a boardroom cold. She had everything money could buy, except warmth. Those closest to her knew better than to bring up birthdays or anniversaries, because those dates only reminded her of people she'd lost, of ghosts that haunted her nights. This dinner with her son Daniel was nothing more than a distraction, a way to pass another lonely evening in a world of steel and glass. Daniel was already on his phone discussing mergers and acquisitions, his tone smooth and detached. "Mother, if we don't make a move on Meridian Tech, someone else will. The board wants an answer." Victoria just nodded absently, her gaze wandering around the pristine dining room, until it landed on a waitress quietly refilling their water glasses. The young woman moved quickly but not carelessly. Her dark hair was pulled back into a simple ponytail, and the faint wear on her uniform cuffs suggested she worked long hours. She seemed invisible to the rest of the diners, but not to Victoria. Not when she noticed the chain glinting from beneath the girl's collar. It was a delicate silver chain, the kind a child might wear, and at its center, a star-shaped locket with a sapphire no bigger than a pinhead. Victoria's breath hitched in her throat. Her manicured hand froze on the stem of her wine glass, and the chatter of the restaurant faded to a dull roar. That necklace. It couldn't be. She knew every engraving, every tiny imperfection etched into that piece of jewelry, because she had made it herself more than 50 years ago for the baby girl she was forced to give away. Her chest tightened as she stared eyes wide, and a sound escaped her lips, a sharp, broken sob that seemed to shatter the illusion of control she'd worn like armor for decades. The waitress, startled, stepped back. Daniel finally looked up from his phone alarm flickering across his face. "Mother, are you all right?" But Victoria couldn't speak. She was already reaching for the girl's arm, her voice trembling. "That necklace. Where did you get that necklace?" The young woman, whose name tag read Sophie, instinctively clutched the locket, tucking it under her collar like it was a secret only she was meant to keep. Her expression was confused, almost fearful, but polite. "It was my mom's," she murmured. Daniel stood, attempting to smooth over the scene. "Apologies, miss. My mother isn't feeling well." He reached into his wallet, slipping a crisp $100 bill toward her like it was a bandage for the moment. "For your trouble." But Victoria's grip was surprisingly strong. "No, please," she begged softly. "Don't go. That necklace, I need to know." Sophie hesitated, glancing around at the other diners, staring at them, at the maitre d' hovering nearby, unsure whether to intervene. Daniel's jaw tightened. "Mother, enough. You're causing a scene." He pried her fingers off Sophie's arm and pressed more bills into the waitress's hand. "Go. We're fine." Sophie shook her head and slipped the money back onto the table. "Thank you, sir, but I don't want it." Her voice was steady, but her eyes flicked back to Victoria, and there was something there. Empathy. Sophie gave a small bow of her head before walking away quickly. Daniel sat back down, his expression hard. "Mother, what was that?" Victoria didn't answer. She was staring at the kitchen door. Sophie had disappeared behind her, tears drying on her cheeks. In that moment, the billionaire who'd conquered boardrooms and silenced rivals felt the walls of her world cracking. She wasn't thinking about money or power. She was thinking about a hospital room decades ago, about the baby she'd named Lily, about her parents' cold words, and the cruel decision they'd made for her. She'd sewn that very locket into her daughter's swaddle as a promise she'd never been able to keep. Later that night, in her penthouse overlooking Lake Michigan, Victoria placed a call to a man named Robert Kane. Robert was a private investigator she'd used for high-stakes corporate cases, a man who knew how to dig where others couldn't. "I want everything you can find on that waitress," she said, her voice calm but electric with urgency. "Her name is Sophie Rivera. She works at Auberge on State Street. Find her address, her family, everything. Daniel overheard the call and tried to intervene. Mother, this is absurd. You're obsessing over a waitress with a trinket that looks like something you once owned. I'll handle it. But Victoria's voice was sharp, unyielding. No, Daniel, you won't. Robert's report came quickly. Sophie lived in a crumbling apartment on the south side, working 2 jobs to care for her sick mother, Clara, whose medical bills were crushing them. The description of Clara stopped Victoria cold, mid-60s, soft gray eyes, a gentle face. A face that might have been her own if life had been different. Daniel had a different reaction. He saw leverage, not connection. Within days, Sophie was cornered after her shift at a diner by one of Daniel's assistants, who escorted her into a sleek black sedan. Daniel sat across from her, his expression cold. Miss Rivera. He began smoothly sliding a check across the seat, $75,000. All you need to do is hand over the necklace and sign a non-disclosure agreement. You walk away, and you'll never have to see us again. Sophie blinked at the check, her hands trembling, but she shook her head. It's not for sale. It's the only thing I have from my mom. Daniel leaned back, his smile sharp. We know about your mom, her condition, the debt. I'm offering you a lifeline, Sophie. That necklace is meaningless to you. To my mother, it's a dangerous obsession. Let us end this. She flinched at his words, her pulse pounding. You can't threaten me. Oh, I'm not threatening, Daniel said softly. Just explaining. People like us, we can make things very hard for people like you. The car door opened, and Sophie stumbled out, heart-racing tears pricking her eyes. She sprinted through the drizzle back to her apartment, where her mother sat in a worn armchair by the window. Clara looked up with a soft smile. You look pale, baby. What happened? Sophie dropped to her knees and buried her face in her mother's lap, telling her everything. Clara listened quietly, her hand stroking Sophie's hair. Then she whispered something Sophie had never heard before. That necklace. It was given to me by my real mother. They told me she loved me, but she couldn't keep me. She called me Lily. Sophie froze. Lily. She looked at the locket she'd worn since childhood, fingers trembling as she searched for a clasp she'd never been able to open. Clara guided her hand to a tiny notch. Press there, she murmured. Sophie did, and with a faint click, the locket opened. Inside was a faded photograph of a young woman with sea-blue eyes and a radiant smile. On the other side, engraved in delicate script, were 4 words, for Lily. Find me. Sophie's breath caught. The woman in the picture was unmistakable. It was the billionaire who'd cried at her table. The next evening, there was a soft knock on Sophie's door. She hesitated, fear curling in her stomach. But when she opened it, Victoria Langston stood there, not the icy queen from the restaurant, but a grandmother trembling with hope. She was dressed simply, her silver hair loose around her shoulders, her eyes glistening. May I please come in, she whispered. Sophie stepped aside. Victoria's gaze swept the apartment, pausing on Clara in her chair. Her voice broke as she said the name she hadn't spoken in half a century. Lily. The room felt suspended in time. Sophie held up the open locket, tears in her eyes. She told me everything she whispered. Victoria crossed the room and knelt in front of Clara, cupping her daughter's face with trembling hands. I never stopped looking for you, she whispered through tears. I'm so sorry, my darling girl. They took you from me, but I never stopped. For a moment, something flickered in Clara's foggy gaze, a recognition buried deep within. She leaned into her mother's touch like an instinct she couldn't name. Sophie stood frozen, watching her family come back together in her tiny apartment. The fragile moment shattered when the door slammed open. Daniel strode in, flanked by 2 suited men, fury etched into every line of his face. Enough of this nonsense, he snapped. This girl has manipulated you, Mother. We're leaving. Take the necklace. One of the men stepped forward, reaching for Sophie, but Victoria rose to her full height, her voice like a whip. You will not touch her. Daniel blinked in shock as his mother's calm mask slipped, replaced by raw, fiery rage. "This is my granddaughter. And that woman," she said, pointing at Clara, "is my daughter. The child your grandparents forced me to give away because they thought money and reputation mattered more than love." Daniel faltered. "That's impossible. You've never—" "Because I was made to feel ashamed," she thundered. "Because I was 17 in love with a man they deemed beneath me, and they tore us apart. They told me to forget her. I never did." She turned to Sophie, her eyes softening. "This young woman refused all your bribes, all your threats, because this locket meant more than money. That is what integrity looks like, Daniel. You could learn from her." Sophie opened her palm, showing him the engraving, the photograph. Daniel's face drained of color. He looked at Clara, at Sophie, and for the first time saw family where he'd seen obstacles. Without a word, he left his bodyguards trailing behind him. In the silence that followed, Victoria wrapped her arms around Sophie. "It doesn't matter if he comes around," she murmured. "What matters is us. I'm bringing the best doctors in the country for your mother. You'll have a home, a future." Sophie sobbed into her shoulder, overwhelmed. Victoria stroked her hair, whispering about Thomas, the father. Sophie never knew a painter who'd made the locket with his own hands, a man who'd loved Lily with his whole soul. That night, in a cramped apartment smelling of rain and worn carpet, the billionaire who'd spent her life building empires finally found what she'd been missing: her family. For once, her fortune wasn't power. It was love, fragile and real and priceless. What would you have done in Sophie's place? Would you have sold the necklace to save your family, or would you have held on like she did no matter the cost? Drop your thoughts below. Share this story with someone who believes in the power of family, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories that prove the most extraordinary tales are hidden in ordinary lives.